The letter arrived at the War Office on a Tuesday in November, and the man who opened it was not supposed to be there at all. He was supposed to be at Ashworth Park, convalescing in the East Wing with his leg elevated on a bolster, and his steward bringing reports every second morning. He was supposed to be resting. Everyone had told him so with great firmness and not a little exasperation, and he had listened to all of them with the quiet patience of a man who had already decided otherwise. The wound from Waterloo had closed cleanly by September. By October he had been walking without a cane. By the first week of November he had arranged through a single carefully worded note to General Sir Thomas Harwood to be placed in the correspondence room of the War Office, under his family name only, without title, processing the backlog of pension and casualty letters that had accumulated since June. His rank was known to 2 men in the building. To the clerks at the adjacent desks, he was Mr. Ashworth, a gentleman volunteer with neat handwriting and an unhurried disposition. He opened perhaps 40 letters that Tuesday morning. He set most aside after a single reading, sorted into their appropriate categories with a competence that surprised the junior clerk who had been assigned to supervise him. One letter he read twice. It was written on ordinary paper, the kind a household might purchase in quantity for domestic correspondence. The handwriting was clear and precise without being rigid, the hand of someone who wrote regularly and had learned that clarity was a courtesy to the reader. It was not addressed from the woman who had sent it. It was written on behalf of a family named Dowell, whose son, a private in the 52nd Regiment, had been listed among the casualties at Waterloo, and whose mother had received no pension notification in 5 months. The letter stated the facts plainly, without ornament, and at the end it observed in a single sentence that cost the writer something to include that Mrs. Dowell had 3 younger children, and that a delay of this duration, while perhaps unremarkable from an administrative perspective, was not unremarkable from hers. The letter was signed Charlotte Hayes. He did not know who Charlotte Hayes was. He noted the address at the top, a townhouse in Clarges Street, and he understood from the address that she was a gentlewoman writing unsanctioned correspondence for a woman who had no access to official channels and no name that would open doors. He processed the Dowell pension that afternoon, flagged the file for immediate resolution, and placed Charlotte Hayes's letter in his coat pocket rather than the discard pile. That evening, walking the 4 streets from the War Office to his lodgings in Jermyn Street, he read it once more. He had not planned to seek an introduction. He was convalescent, technically, and he had enough occupying him without adding a social pursuit to the list. He returned to Clarges Street in his mind several times over the following week, turning the letter's last sentence over without quite acknowledging why, and then a mutual acquaintance named Hargreaves mentioned in passing that Lady Dorothea Hayes was entertaining on Wednesday evenings, and that her daughter was said to be a steady sort of young woman with excellent sense, and the conjunction arrived without ceremony and without any particular dramatic weight. And he arranged an introduction for the following Wednesday as Mr. Ashworth, a minor gentleman with War Office connections. He had not anticipated the lending library, but that came later. First, there was the morning room at the Clarges Street townhouse, and Lady Dorothea, and the precise and unilluminating way the woman assessed every person who entered her drawing room as either useful to her matrimonial calendar or not. Charlotte had been up since 7:30. She had answered 4 letters for the household before her mother was dressed, including one from their solicitor regarding the lease on the Wiltshire property, that she had not been asked to answer, but that would not have been answered otherwise. She had arranged the flowers in the front hall because the second housemaid had been ill since Monday, and Mrs. Agnes Foyle, the housekeeper, was managing too many things at once to attend to decorative arrangements. She had put on her good grey wool dress and her mother's second-best shawl because it was cold, and her own shawl had a pulled thread she had not yet had time to mend. and she had sat down in the morning room at 9 o'clock, with a cup of tea that was already lukewarm and a stack of household accounts that needed reviewing before her mother woke. She was not unaware that her life had taken on a particular quality of invisible industry. She had been managing the practical administration of the Hayes household since her father died 4 years ago, and her mother had never precisely asked her to do this, and never precisely thanked her for it, and never precisely noticed the gap that would open if she stopped. Lady Dorothea noticed the flowers when they were wrong. She did not notice them when they were right. Charlotte was 24 years old. She had dark hair that she wore plainly, brown eyes that her mother occasionally described as her best feature in a tone that suggested this was not saying very much, and hands that were always doing something. She read widely, spoke French and some Italian, kept the household accounts with an accuracy the solicitor had remarked upon twice, and had the quality, uncommon and sometimes inconvenient, of saying precisely what she meant in the fewest words available. She was reviewing the coal merchant's invoice when Mrs. Foyle knocked and put her head around the door to say that Mr. Ashworth had called. Charlotte had not heard of Mr. Ashworth. She looked up. Mrs. Foyle's expression was neutral in the particular way that meant she had formed an opinion and was keeping it in reserve. "Hargreaves's introduction," Mrs. Foyle said. "Your mother is expecting him." Charlotte set down the invoice. She would learn in subsequent weeks that this was one of 2 ways she had the news of her own social arrangements, from Mrs. Foyle or from the arrangements themselves. She went down to the drawing room. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, looking out at the street with the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting without restlessness. He was perhaps 30, lean, with close-cropped dark hair, and a way of carrying himself that did not match the modest coat. Charlotte noticed the coat first because it was a good cut, worn without attention to it, the way a man wears clothes that fit well because they have always been made well, and he has never had occasion to think otherwise. She noticed his hands second, resting at his sides clean, still without occupation. He turned when Lady Dorothea introduced him. He had grey eyes and a composed mouth, and he looked at Charlotte for a moment, before he looked at her mother, which was not the order most visitors managed. "Miss Hayes," he said. His voice was level and precise. "It is a pleasure." "Mr. Ashworth," she said. "Welcome to Clarges Street." Lady Dorothea said several warm things about Hargreaves and the convenience of London in winter, and the recent news from the continent, and Mr. Ashworth listened to all of them with the particular quality of attention that managed to be entirely present without offering very much in return. Charlotte sat in the chair nearest the window and watched him. He answered her mother's questions in measured sentences and volunteered nothing. When Lady Dorothea's attention was diverted by the entrance of the tea tray, he turned briefly to Charlotte and said, very quietly, "Do you find London convenient in winter, Miss Hayes?" The question had a dry edge. She met his eyes and found something there that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "I find it cold," she said, "and the coal merchant overcharges." He looked at her for a moment. "He does," he agreed, "considerably." It was not a courtship beginning. It was nothing Charlotte could have named with confidence. It was a brief exchange of 2 sentences beside a tea tray, and it cost her nothing, and she thought about it intermittently for the next 4 days. The lending library on Grafton Street became the place where they encountered each other, apparently by coincidence, on 3 occasions over the following fortnight. Charlotte went on Tuesdays and Fridays to exchange volumes and to sit at the table near the west window when it was not occupied, because the light there was good and the room was quiet, and it was one of the few places in her week that no one had a claim on her for the duration of a chapter. She was reading a natural history and a collection of essays, and had been waiting 3 weeks for a particular volume of Cowper that the library kept circulating before she could collect it. Mr. Ashworth arrived on the second Tuesday after the drawing-room visit at 2:15 in the afternoon. He was browsing the shelf nearest the window when Charlotte came in, and he turned at her entrance with the unhurried quality that was becoming familiar, and said good afternoon, and asked whether she had found Cowper. "Not yet," she said. "It is apparently a popular volume." "Mrs. Ramsay at the desk has a copy held for her nephew," he said. "He will not collect it before Thursday. If you spoke to her, she might hold it for you instead." Charlotte looked at him. "How do you know about Mrs. Ramsay's nephew?" "She mentioned him," he said with that almost not amusement. "I was waiting for a volume last week, and she mentioned him at some length." Charlotte went to speak to Mrs. Ramsay, who was indeed willing to redirect the Cowper, and when she returned to the reading table he was already settled at the far end with a volume of military history open before him. She sat at the window end. For an hour they read in companionable silence, which Charlotte found, without quite examining the fact, as easy as silence with anyone she had known for considerably longer. The second encounter, on a Friday 3 days later, produced a conversation about Cowper that lasted 40 minutes and moved from poetry to the management of correspondence to the question of what constituted plain speaking in a world that rewarded its opposite. Charlotte found herself saying things she had not said aloud before, and he listened without interruption and answered without performance. And when she closed her book to leave, he stood and said, "The natural history you were reading last week. Is it the Pennant? I have been curious about the third volume." It was. She told him what the third volume contained. He looked at her with that grey gaze that had a quality of attention she could not precisely categorize. And she walked home in the cold with the Cowper under her arm, and Mrs. Foyle's shawl pulled close, and she was aware with a clarity that required no examination that something was accumulating. At home her mother was in the drawing-room with Colonel Prentice Halford. Charlotte had known of Colonel Halford for 2 months. He had called 4 times. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, self-congratulatory in the way of a man who had survived a war and expected the fact to be its own continuous recommendation. He spoke in short declarative sentences about his own opinions and listened to other people's contributions with the patient tolerance of someone waiting for his turn. He had a property in Hertfordshire and a comfortable income and no particular cruelty about him, which Charlotte's mother had apparently concluded was sufficient to constitute a desirable match. Charlotte was not consulted about this conclusion. "Colonel Halford has been asking after you," her mother said, as Charlotte came through the drawing-room door. The tone was bright and pointed, the way Lady Dorothea's tones became when she was encoding a communication that was meant to sound like information, but was actually an instruction. Colonel Halford stood and made a slight bow. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I was just telling your mother about the improvements I've made to the south pasture at Halford House." "Indeed," Charlotte said. She sat down and folded her hands and listened to 17 minutes of the south pasture, and then the Hertfordshire roads, and then the current price of grain, and she said the correct number of appropriate things in the appropriate register, and drank her tea and watched the clock above the mantelpiece, and thought about a conversation concerning the nature of plain speaking that had lasted 40 minutes and had not required her to perform anything at all. When Colonel Halford departed, her mother looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has arranged something successfully. "He is a reliable man," Lady Dorothea said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "He has intentions." "I understand that. You might make some effort to be encouraging, Charlotte." Charlotte said nothing. She picked up her book. Her mother left the room. The third library meeting, on the following Tuesday, was the one Charlotte returned to afterward when she wished to understand how things had proceeded. They were at the window table, both reading, and the conversation had begun about the cowper and migrated to the question of what a person owed a correspondence they had written without authorization. She had said something vague and slightly deflecting, and he had been quiet for a moment. And then he had said, without looking up from his page, "The best letters are the ones written when no one is watching." She looked at him. He was still looking at his page. "I have written 2 letters like that," she said. He was quiet again. The fire in the lending library's small grate shifted and settled, and a drop of rain came against the window, and another. "I imagine they were red," he said. She did not know why the sentence struck her the way it did. She looked down at her book. The words on the page were not registering. He turned a page, and she could see in her peripheral vision that his profile was entirely composed, and that the quality of his attention, even turned toward a page of military history, had a steadiness that she had begun to find, against all practical judgment, the most restful thing in her week. She did not ask him what he meant. She folded the thought away carefully and went home and sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. It was 3 days later that she heard her mother's voice through the morning room door. Charlotte had come downstairs early, as she often did, intending to collect the household accounts from the morning room writing desk before her mother was awake. She had her hand on the door handle when she heard her mother's voice inside, and then Mrs. Foyle's, and she understood from the tone that a private exchange was in progress. And she hesitated. She should have gone back upstairs. She knew that afterward, with perfect clarity. Instead, she stood on the other side of the door in the cold corridor with her hand still on the handle, and she heard her mother say her name. And she listened. "Charlotte is not difficult to place, if one is practical about it," Lady Dorothea said. Her voice had the particular quality it took on when she was speaking about practical matters, clear and somewhat businesslike, the tone she used with the solicitor. "She has no particular beauty, she has no dowry to speak of, and she is 24, which is not insurmountable but requires a certain realism about expectations. Colonel Halford is the realistic option. He wants a woman who can manage a household and be unobtrusive about it, and Charlotte can certainly do that. Whether she can do anything else is beside the point." Mrs. Foyle said something Charlotte could not make out. Her tone was neutral, which meant, in Mrs. Foyle's vocabulary, that she disagreed and had decided not to say so directly. "She can read whatever she likes afterward," her mother said. "That is not the question. The question is whether she will be sensible enough to understand her situation before Colonel Halford's patience runs out." Charlotte stood in the corridor for a moment after her mother's voice stopped. The cold of the flagstone floor came through the soles of her shoes. The house was very quiet around her, the particular quiet of an early morning when the fires had not yet been built up, when the rooms were simply themselves without anyone performing a purpose inside them. She was not surprised. That was the first thing she understood, standing there, and it was worse than surprise would have been. She had known the architecture of her mother's assessment for years, had known it the way one knows the dimensions of a room one has always lived in, and hearing it stated plainly in that business-like voice simply put words to a shape she had been navigating by feel. She was a household management problem. She was a placement question. She was, in the moral accounting of her mother's world, adequately functional for Colonel Halford's practical requirements, and that was the sum of the matter. She went back upstairs. She sat at the edge of her bed and looked at the grey morning window for 10 minutes. Then she put on her shoes and went back down and did the accounts, and arranged for the coal, and answered 2 letters, and attended to the 3rd housemaid's request about the linen cupboard. And no one who saw her that morning would have known anything had shifted. Mrs. Foyle brought her a cup of tea at 9:30 and set it on the desk without a word, and did not leave immediately. She stood for a moment near the doorway with her hands clasped, and Charlotte looked up. "The accounts are balanced," Charlotte said. "I know," said Mrs. Foyle. She left the tea and withdrew, and Charlotte drank it while it was still hot, which was the only small luxury available to her that morning, and which she took deliberately. Colonel Halford called on Thursday. He arrived at 3:00, which Charlotte had been told by her mother's pointed mention of Thursday afternoon and the request that she be available. She came down to the drawing-room in her grey wool dress, which she had pressed herself that morning because the second housemaid was still recovering. Her mother was already there, sitting very upright, with the expression she wore when she had organised a room to produce a particular outcome. Colonel Halford was also upright. He was wearing his best coat, which Charlotte noted with a particular sensation in the region of her chest that was adjacent to resignation. He stood when she entered and made a bow that was slightly more deliberate than usual, and she understood in the first 3 seconds of the room exactly what was about to occur. Her mother found a reason to step out within 5 minutes. Colonel Halford cleared his throat. He was not a man given to subtlety, and he did not attempt any now. He said that he had spoken to Lady Dorothea, and that he had formed a high opinion of the Hayes household, and of Charlotte in particular, and that he was in a position to offer her a comfortable establishment at Halford House, and that he hoped she would do him the honour of accepting his hand. He was not unkind about it. He was entirely himself, competent, self-assured, wholly without curiosity about her response beyond whether it would be yes. She had planned nothing. She had not rehearsed a speech or composed an argument. She had simply, sometime between standing in the corridor on Monday morning and pressing her grey dress on Thursday morning, arrived at a complete certainty, and certainty did not require preparation. "Thank you, Colonel Halford," she said. "I am sensible of the honour. I cannot accept." He stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" "I cannot accept your proposal. I am sorry if there has been any misunderstanding about my inclination in this matter." "Your inclination," he repeated, with the tone of a man encountering a word in an unfamiliar context. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, reassembling his understanding of the room. Then he said stiffly that he hoped she understood what she was declining, and she said that she did, and then he said that he presumed she would reconsider after reflection, and she said, with the level patience she had developed over 4 years of navigating this household, that she did not expect her position to change. Her mother's entrance 2 minutes later produced a scene of some intensity. Charlotte sat through it with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her expression at the particular neutral she had been cultivating since she was 19. She said very little. Her mother said a great deal. Colonel Halford departed, as men of his temperament do when the social script has ceased to serve them, with compressed dignity and no farewell beyond a curt nod. Her mother's words after he left were a sharper version of the corridor conversation, now delivered directly and at some volume. Charlotte was ungrateful. Charlotte was impractical. Charlotte was throwing away the last reasonable opportunity available to a woman in her position, and if she was waiting for something better to materialize, she would be waiting a very long time. Charlotte said, "Yes, Mamma," twice, which was not agreement, but was what the room required. She went to bed that night with a clarity she had not felt in months. Not happiness precisely. Something more structural than that. She had refused a thing, and the refusal stood, and the standing cost something, and she had known it would and done it anyway. She thought briefly about the library and the window and the rain against the glass and the sentence about letters being read when no one was watching. She put it away and slept. She was at the writing desk on Friday morning when Mrs. Foyle appeared in the doorway with an expression that had moved from neutral to something more carefully arranged. "Mr. Ashworth has called," she said. "He has asked whether you are at home." Charlotte set down her pen. "At this hour?" "He brought a card," Mrs. Foyle said, and held it out. It was an ordinary calling card. Mr. E. Ashworth, with a Jermyn Street address, nothing remarkable. And yet Mrs. Foyle was standing in the doorway with that particular quality of stillness that Charlotte had learned over years to read as deliberate restraint. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. "He also brought a companion," Mrs. Foyle said. "A Mr. Ray, who works with him at the War Office. Mr. Ray would like to pay his respects to your mother." Charlotte did not understand the shape of this yet. "My mother is not up." "No," said Mrs. Foyle. "She is not." Charlotte came downstairs. The front sitting room held two men. The first was Mr. Ashworth, standing at the window in the same composed posture she had seen on the first morning, his hands at his sides, his coat, she noticed, considerably better than the one he had worn to the drawing-room in November. The second was a man of perhaps 55, with a military bearing and greyish side whiskers, and the particular bearing of someone senior in a hierarchy whose seniority is not in question. He was examining the portrait above the mantelpiece with the courtesy of a man who has been asked to wait, and is doing so agreeably. "Miss Hayes," Mr. Ashworth said. He looked at her with the grey gaze, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something behind it she had not yet understood. "I hope we are not calling at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all," she said. She looked at his companion. "This is Mr. Ray," said Mr. Ashworth. "He has been a colleague at the War Office." "Miss Hayes," said Mr. Ray pleasantly. "Your mother is Lady Dorothea Hayes? I believe she is acquainted with General Harwood." "She is," Charlotte said. And then her mother was in the doorway, summoned by Mrs. Foyle with remarkable efficiency, still arranging her morning cap with the expression of a woman who is not pleased to be caught unprepared, but intends to manage the situation with style. She looked at Mr. Ray and recognized a man worth knowing in the way she recognized all such men before she had learned anything about them, and she smiled warmly and extended her hand. "Mr. Ray," she said, "how good of you to call." "Lady Dorothea," Mr. Ray said, "I hope you will forgive the early hour. I wanted to accompany my colleague and present my respects." He glanced at Mr. Ashworth with the easy familiarity of a long professional association. "I trust you know him by his family name, but I confess I cannot bring myself to omit his proper address. Forgive me." He looked back at Lady Dorothea with genuine pleasantness. "My Lord Ashworth has been an ornament to our department this autumn, and we shall be considerably the poorer when he returns to his estate." The room changed. It changed in the specific way that rooms change when a fact is introduced into them that rearranges the furniture of every assumption without touching a single physical object. Lady Dorothea stood very still. Charlotte stood very still. The fire in the grate continued its quiet work, and outside on Clarges Street, a cart went past over the cobbles, and none of it mattered at all. "My lord," her mother said. The word came out with a care that had not been there a moment ago. "The title is Ashworth," he said quietly, and the particular quality of his composure, that thing Charlotte had been unable to categorize across all the library afternoons, and the drawing-room teas and the conversations about plain-speaking and coal merchants, was suddenly entirely legible. It was the composure of a man who had been born to a title and understood that the title was not the point. "I should have introduced myself correctly from the beginning, and I ask your forbearance for not doing so." He was looking at Charlotte when he said it, Her mother recovered herself with the speed of a woman who has been navigating drawing rooms for 30 years, and what she produced was remarkable in its way. The immediate and complete revision of every assessment she had been making for 6 weeks, the smile becoming warmer, the manner becoming softer, the posture reorganizing itself around the new information with a fluency that would have been admirable in a different context. "We have been delighted to know you in any address," Lady Dorothea said, which was a sentence she could not quite have meant, but which she said with perfect conviction. "Charlotte has so enjoyed your acquaintance." Charlotte looked at her mother for one moment, clearly without inflection, and then she looked at him. "I knew," she said, "that something did not quite fit the coat." He looked at her with the grey eyes, and the almost not amusement was entirely present now, and something warmer beneath it. "The coat," he said, "was deliberately chosen." Mr. Ray was examining the portrait above the mantelpiece again with the focused attention of a man who understands when a room requires him to be somewhere else in it. Lady Dorothea made a small sound that was the beginning of something, and then decided, with visible effort, not to complete it. "I wonder," said the Earl of Ashworth with the precision that Charlotte had been listening to across a library table for a fortnight, "whether Miss Hayes might show me the lending library she has described. The Grafton Street establishment. I have a volume to return." Charlotte looked at him. "Now?" "If it is convenient." Mrs. Foyle appeared in the doorway with Charlotte's shawl, the good one, fully mended, which Charlotte had left on the chair in the hall that morning. She held it out with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment and had planned for it accordingly. Charlotte took the shawl and put it on. The 4 streets from Clarges Street to the lending library on Grafton Street were cold and clear. The November sky, the flat white of a morning that has decided against drama. He walked at her pace without comment. She could feel, without looking directly at him, the quality of his attention, the same as it had been at the library table and in the drawing room and at every encounter across the past 6 weeks, except that the thing it had been covering was now simply itself. "You were there," she said as they turned onto the first cross street, "when my letters arrived at the War Office." "I was there in November," he said. "I processed the Dowell correspondence. The pension was approved within the week." Charlotte looked ahead at the street. "Mrs. Dowell received word in December," she said. "She sent a note to Clarges Street. I did not understand how it had been resolved so quickly." "The letter was persuasive," he said. "It was plain," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." They walked another street in silence. A woman selling hot chestnuts from a brazier called out from the corner, and Charlotte shook her head and he shook his, without being asked, and the small synchrony of it was unremarkable and entirely pleasant. "You read it twice," she said. She was not sure how she knew this, whether it was a surmise or a certainty. It felt like certainty. He was quiet for a moment. "I read it twice," he confirmed. "The first time for the content, the second time because of the last sentence." Charlotte thought about the last sentence which she had written and then considered removing, and then left, because it was true, and because the omission of true things was a habit she was trying to resist. "I was not certain it was appropriate to include." "It was the most important sentence in the letter," he said. The lending library was ahead of them at the end of the street. Its windows were lit against the flat sky, the familiar yellow of lamplight through glass. Charlotte could see Mrs. Ramsay behind the desk, organizing a stack of returned volumes with the efficient impatience that characterized her mornings. He held the door for her. She crossed the threshold. Inside, the library was warm and smelled of paper and coal smoke, and the particular dust of rooms that contain a great many books and have been heated repeatedly over a long winter. The west window table was unoccupied. Charlotte went to it without thinking, because she always went to it, and sat in the chair she always occupied, and he sat at the far end as he had been sitting across from her for the past 2 weeks. He reached into his coat. What he produced was a folded sheet of ordinary paper, slightly worn at the creases from having been folded and unfolded more than once. He placed it on the table between them, equidistant, and she recognized it before she unfolded it, because the paper was the kind they kept at the Clarges Street writing desk, and the handwriting on the outside was her own. As she picked it up, she unfolded it. The words were familiar the way an old room is familiar. Slightly smaller than memory, exactly right in every detail. The last sentence was there. "I should have asked your permission before keeping it," he said. "No," she said, and her voice was entirely level because the emotion in the room was too particular and too present to be inflected. "You should not." She looked at the letter in her hands for a long moment. The fire in the library's small grate made its familiar sound. Outside, a cart went past on Grafton Street, and a woman called something to someone, and London went about its business in the cheerful indifference of a city that does not wait for private moments to resolve. She refolded the letter along its original creases. "Mrs. Dowell has 3 children," she said. "I know," he said. "The pension is confirmed." She placed the letter on the table between them. She did not keep it, and she did not return it. She left it there in the midpoint, which was its natural location. He looked at it, and then at her. "I have a library at Ashworth Park," he said, "that has not been properly catalogued in 11 years. "That seems like a significant oversight," she said. "It does," he said. "I have been thinking about how to address it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The almost not amusement was entirely present, and something that was not amusement at all. Something steadier and considerably warmer, under it. "I speak plain English," she said, "and some French." "I am aware," he said. "And I overcharge for nothing," she said, "unlike the coal merchant." "I have observed that," he said, with great attention. Charlotte looked down at the letter on the table. Her handwriting looked back at her from the outside fold, clear and precise, and entirely itself. The hand of someone who had written when no one was watching and had not known anyone was reading. She thought about the morning room door and her mother's businesslike voice and the cold flagstones through her shoes and Colonel Halford's bewildered face and the shawl Mrs. Foyle had been holding ready in the hall. She picked up the letter and placed it inside the cover of her cowper, which was sitting at the edge of the table where she had left it on Tuesday, because Mrs. Ramsay kept it reserved and did not let anyone else take it. He watched her do this without comment. She closed the cowper. She folded her hands on the table. The fire settled, and the rain that had been threatening since morning arrived at last against the west window. Quiet and steady, the kind of rain that does not ask permission. She was in the chair she always sat in, at the table where she always sat, in the lending library 4 streets from Clarges Street, which was the same distance it had always been, and she was entirely, without performance or announcement, where she belonged. He reached across the table and turned his volume to a new page, and she opened hers, and the rain came down on Grafton Street in the grey November afternoon, and the library held them both in its warm, unhurried quiet, and the letter stayed where she had put it, pressed between the pages of the cowper, in her own handwriting, in the hand of someone who had learned that plain speaking, when it is honest and when it costs something, and when it is offered without calculation into the ordinary silence of a room, finds its reader eventually. It always does.